As an American artist working in the form of Butoh, it's always been important for me to discover the Western roots of the work that I do. I'm not Japanese and I have no desire to dance as if I'm Japanese, but whether I call what I do Butoh or not, there is a Western way into this work. And what follows is just a few thoughts I have on that subject. There were, of course, many Western influences on Tatsumi Hijikata and Kazuo Ohno, the founders of Butoh. Before World War II, the only authentic Japanese dances were traditional dances. The very thought that a dance could embody the spirit of an individual dancer came to Japan through the West. Very important in this development was the work of Mary Wigman, a German expressionist dancer who developed this style of dance called New Dance. One of Kazuo Ohno's first inspirations to dance was a performance he saw by Howell Kreutzberg in 1934. Howell Kreutzberg was a German expressionist dancer and himself a student of Mary Wigman. Kazuo Ohno's first dance teacher, Baku Ushii, who was a pioneer of a distinctly Japanese style of modern dance, was himself a student in the Mary Wigman New Dance tradition. Another important teacher of Kazuo Ohno was Takaya Oguchi, who had also studied dance with Mary Wigman. Kazuo Ohno studied with Oguchi both before and after World War II. And Tatsumi Hijikata had studied dance with Kasuko Matsumura, another student of Oguchi's. And you can see how the ideas and influences of this German new dance kind of constellated around the early Butoh dancers. Wigman's conception of dance was that dance should involve a spiritual transformation of the dancer. She stressed that dance does not represent, it is. She often danced in silence or to simple percussion scores because she felt that the music should not control the movements of the dancers, but the movement needs to spring from the dancer's inner life. She sought to transcend the personal and become a vessel for universal forces. All of these elements are also very important to Butoh. Wigman's description of her own dance as a lustful destruction of the physical being, a process in which for seconds I almost felt a oneness with the cosmos. That could have been written by a Butoh dancer. The exaggerated wildness of the movements, the psychic intensity, the low down into the earth position, all of this presaged the coming of Butoh. In addition to the influence of the German New Dance, Hijikata was also very influenced by certain European writers like Rimbaud, de Sade, Artaud, Jean Genet. In fact, the first Butoh performance, Kinjiki, even though it was named after a book by Yukio Mishima, was actually more influenced by the writings of Jean Genet. The influence of Genet on the development of Butoh can be found in the surrealist absurdity, in the fascination with the grotesque, transforming the ugly into the beautiful, the rejection of social norms, and the exploration of eroticism. Antonin Artaud's collection of essays, The Theater and Its Double, was first translated into Japanese in 1965, and it had the same galvanizing effect on the Japanese avant-garde as it had had on the American avant-garde when it had been translated a few years earlier. Artaud's call for theater to return to its primal roots in shamanism, in ritual, in mysticism, and in the body deeply resonated with Hijikata. Hijikata's 1968 performance, Tatsumi Hijikata and the Japanese, The Rebellion of the Body, is often seen as an attempt to manifest Artaud's ideas about theater. He danced violently, explosively, spastically. He flung his body against metal plates. He danced with a golden phallus. It ended with him carried aloft by ropes as if they were trying to pull him apart, as if in a form of a crucifixion or a resurrection. But interestingly, for Hijikata, this piece represented a break from Western dance. From then on, his dance would more and more search for the Japanese, for his own body and his memories of childhood, and in the bodies of his dancers. Still, one of Hijikata's most prized possessions was a recording he had of a radio program that Artaud had done shortly before he died of a piece called To Have Done with the Judgment of God.
Le soleil pour installer le royaume de la nuit noire et qui crève la courroie des espaces afin que les espaces de l'espace ne puissent plus jamais se rencontrer ni se croiser.
The continuing influence of Artaud on Butoh can be seen in Butoh's ritualistic elements and in its search for primal modes of being and perceiving. Primal in the sense of exploring pre-cultural aspects of human existence. The profound influence of the Spanish dancer Antonio Merce on Kazuo Ohno is also well known, and I've spoken about it before in other videos. But I also want to mention that while the affinity of Butoh to Buddhist philosophy is very clear, Ohno himself was a Catholic, and this sensibility forms all of his work. He's often described as the light to Hijikata's darkness, an optimism that is entwined with his faith. Ohno is quoted as saying, Jesus was a Butoh master. Akira Kasai, another important Butoh pioneer, left Butoh for 14 years, 7 of which he spent in Germany studying eurythmy, a movement form developed by Rudolf Steiner, the spiritualist, the educator, the philosopher. And even now that Akira Kasai is back in Japan and back doing Butoh, you can still see the influence of Steiner in his work, in his use of sound and words, his exploration of the connection of the sound of words with emotional states, and his explorations of how the relationships between body and space is affected by mental processes. Among current Butoh performers, Eiko and Koma also cite as their mentors in dance not only Kazuo Ohno, but Marija Schimmel, another disciple of Mary Wigman. My point in talking about the Western influences on Butoh is not to deny what is specifically Japanese about the work of the Butoh pioneers, but rather it's to explore how we in the West can use our own cultural heritage to continue and explore this work. Butoh does have similarities to many forms of Western performance that were developing at the same time that Butoh was taking shape. I mentioned before that Artaud's book, The Theater and Its Double, was first translated into Japanese in 1965. It was first translated into English in 1958. It had the same galvanizing influence on Western performers that it had on Japanese performers trying to revitalize their art. Butoh is certainly related aesthetically, if not historically, to the works of Jerzy Grotowski. At the same time that Ohno and Hijikata were taking their first steps into Butoh, Grotowski was working with his Polish theater laboratory and doing work that matched Butoh in many ways, in its insistence on absolute authenticity of movement, in its spiritual questing that sought to transcend individual psychology, in the primacy of inner impulse as a source of all movement, even in the training exercises and the themes of violence and violation that they explored in their productions, and in the astonishing psychic and physical presence of its performers.
I cierpieć jestem nierad, że chcę umrzeć jak desperat. Nie dlatego unuk szloch.
After the 60s ended, Grotowski abandoned the creation of live performance for audiences because he felt, for him, there was an irresolvable conflict between art as performance and art as spiritual practice. He did stress that this was his own solution, or his own attempt to find a solution to that problem, and that other artists, other creators may find different solutions. But for him, there was an irresolvable conflict between artist performance and artist spiritual practice. For the remainder of his life, almost 30 years, Grotowski stopped directing productions and devoted himself entirely to exploring the use of theatrical techniques, movement, dialogue, chant, singing, as a vehicle for the personal spiritual development of the performer. He referred to these stages of his works alternately as paratheatrics, theater of sources, objective theater, and art as vehicle. There's a whole genre of performance, especially on the West Coast in the US, that explores dance, theater, and ritual as a means of spiritual growth And this type of performance has arrived at many of the same places that Butoh has. Practitioners like Anna Holburn in Marin County, Sarah Shelton Mann in San Francisco, and Antero Ali, who calls his work ritual theater, sometimes paratheatrics like Grotowski did. They all have in some way or another touched upon the same ground as Butoh. For example, in Ali's ritual theater, participants first create an inner state of what he calls no form in order to make space for the energies of the universe, whatever they're exploring at the moment, in order to make space for those energies to enter the body and to move them into dance. This is perfectly analogous to the Butoh's empty body, dancing from a place of non-intention. Sarah Shelton Mann's work in dance theater is also deeply rooted in the idea of performance as a vehicle for personal transformation. Her work explores shamanism, ritual, improvisation, meditation, qigong, energy states. And Sarah Shelton Mann was herself deeply influenced by her work with Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen. Cohen's body-mind centering is very resonant with Butoh in its striving to overcome ingrained habitual patterns of movement, and also in its attempts to bring a direct awareness to the experience of being in a body. Maybe because of its root in the chaotic 60s, Butoh also has a lot in common with a certain strain of Western performance art, especially in his preoccupation with trying to do something real that rejects and abandons the artifice of theatricality, the artifice of theater. The idea that Butoh is a transformative way of seeing and of being in the world rather than simply a dance style finds its analog, for example, in the work of the Living Theater. But perhaps with the Living Theater, it didn't have the same kind of Butoh's rigorous emphasis on discipline as a way to avoid self-indulgence. And of course, Butoh was never political the way the Living Theater's work was political. There's also an idea among Butoh artists that by putting your body in a state of crisis, you can shed artifice and come to a more authentic way of being. You can also see this in certain Western performance artists like Chris Burden or Joseph Beuys. When Chris Burden had himself shot in the arm or crucified to a Volkswagen, or when he lay covered in burlap in the middle of a busy highway, he was risking his safety, putting his body in crisis. When Joseph Beuys locked himself in a cage for a week with a wild coyote, he was seeking an experience that transcended performance, something shamanic, a ritual, something real. I've known Butoh artists to perform almost naked in freezing cold, or bury themselves alive as if in a grave, or have their bodies pierced on stage, all in search of that authentic experience, that real, non-theatrical moment. In America, of the many styles of Butoh, the one that is most well known is characteristically thought of as involving extraordinarily slow movements. This creates for both the audience and the performer a transformed relationship with time, and it can generate states of mind that approach those of trance or spiritual meditation. And this is similar to the experimental work that Robert Wilson was creating in the 60s. Extended pieces, sometimes as long as 12 hours, and slow dreamscapes that invite audiences and performers to enter a different way of seeing, a different way of thinking, a different way of being. When you look deeply into Western culture, you can find many artists and thinkers whose work lived in the same realms as modern Butoh artists. William Blake, who Kazuo Ohno talks a lot about in his works, Rilke, Carl Jung in his writings on alchemy. Because Kazuo Ohno and Tatsumi Hijikata were looking for a universal way of moving, an authentic way of moving, there is a Western way into this work. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and sharing it so that other people who might enjoy it can also find it. Also, if you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider subscribing to my channel. I plan to release videos every 2 weeks or so. Some will be essays on the intersection of art and spirituality, and there will also be videos of my own work, my music, and my short films. And finally, if you'd like to support me as a creator, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/BobDiNatale. I'll put a link to that in the description below. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.